Hello everyone and welcome to the GWPF's second webinar. This webinar is going to be on the vitally important topic of the net zero threat to economic recovery. Now, whatever your political views about whether net zero is a good idea or a bad idea, there is no doubt about it. Net zero is an extraordinarily ambitious, radical agenda. This would mean huge changes to almost every element of our lives, to what we eat, how we get about, where we go on holiday, how we heat our homes. This is a policy that will have deep implications for us all, which is why it is so surprising and perhaps disturbing that here in the United Kingdom, there is such a limited debate on this topic. When the GWPF raises it, we are described as denialists and extremists. But it is so important that these debates are held. And indeed, all we can do is calmly, rationally, cogently ask that these issues may be debated and the right questions asked. So joining me today to do exactly that are Lord Lilley, Rupert Darwall and John Constable. Our first guest is going to be Rupert Darwall. And just a moment housekeeping, you should see on your screen along the bottom, there's a Q&A button. So please feed in your questions via the Q&A button as we go along. And then once we've heard from each speaker in turn, we will be coming back to answer some of those questions. So please do feed into that. Now, Rupert Darwall is a fellow of the Real Clear Foundation. He is a strategy consultant and policy advisor, and he began his career working in the City of London before moving to become a special advisor to the then Chancellor of the Exchequer, Norman Lamont. Now, since then, he has written for publications on both sides of the Atlantic, including an extraordinary book called Green Tyranny, Exposing the Totalitarian Roots of the Green Industrial Complex. And lots of the themes from that book are going to be very relevant today. But more recently, he has published a fantastic new report for the GWPF. I've got a copy here. It's called The Climate Noose: Business, Net Zero, and the IPCC's Anti-Capitalism. So we're hoping that Rupert might also be able to tell us a bit more about his new report during his comments. So Rupert, thank you so much for joining us. We're delighted to have you, and I will pass it over to you to start things off.
Delighted to be joining, Harry. Thanks for the intro. It is, as you say, an absolutely pressing issue and one that's been very misrepresented. And one misrepresentation came from the Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, talking the other day, where he talked about net zero. He said embracing net zero, and he then went on to say there's no choice between cutting our emissions and growing our economy. That's a myth the UK has helped to shatter over the past decade, forgetting, of course, that our productivity growth has been the weakest since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. But more interestingly, more honest, was a view from across the channel. I can hold this up. I hope you can see it, from Emmanuel Macron in his Thinking the Unthinkable interview with the Financial Times, in which he's talked about climate change in the same breath as the coronavirus lockdown. And he talked about it requiring very brutal and profound choices. And that, of course, is what it is about. It is a brutal and profound choice. And in the run-up to the Paris Agreement, which we're now cursed to be under, The former UN climate boss, Ivo de Boer, said the only way you can get to 2 degrees was by shutting down the whole global economy. Now, we've got an inkling of what that's like now with the pandemic. But instead of going for 2 degrees at Paris, they went for 1.5 degree. 1.5 degree limit was written into the Paris Agreement as an aspiration. And always remember that it's 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees above pre-industrial temperatures, whatever they might be. And that is the giveaway, because for the climate crowd, for the environmental ministries around the world and the environmental movement in general, the Industrial Revolution is the original sin. So what you see when you read this stuff, what you're really getting is, you see the anti-industrialization program of the Green Movement. But looking at that 1.5 degree, I thought it'd be, in my report I look at this, you may remember in the run-up to the Copenhagen conference, which was going to be the last one, Gordon Brown actually made a speech saying 50 days, less than 50 days before the conference that will decide the next 50 years. But of course, Copenhagen turned out to be a fart. But in the run-up to that conference, President Nasheed of the Maldives held the world's first underwater cabinet meeting, and it was to highlight the apparent threat of global warming to small island states like his own, like the Maldives and so forth. And it's been a consistent theme of the UN that small island states are in the front lines of climate change. They're the ones will be obliterated by rising sea levels and so forth. And in 1989, a UN spokesman said, by the year 2000, if climate change isn't reversed, we'll see nations wiped off the planet. And only last year, 30 years on, of course, that prediction went the way of all predictions, but only last year, the Secretary General of the UN was saying the same thing about Tuvalu. But the interesting thing is, there is no scientific basis to this whatsoever. The 1.5 degree limit that was written into the UN Climate Pact in Paris in 2015, there is no science to it. As Charles Darwin, on the final year of the Voyage of the Beagle, hypothesized when he was only 25, small islands or coral atolls are actually built from the slow subsidence of the seabed. And there you have it. And the one valuable thing the IPCC did in its special report was actually debunk that, except none of the politicians have actually read it or realized that. But if you do read the 1.5 degrees special report, your IPCC special report, what you'll find there is a profoundly anti-growth, degrowth manifesto. There's a paragraph in there that I think gives the whole game away. It talks about global economic growth. And it said it's been global economic growth, which of course has lifted billions out of poverty. It says it's the spread of fossil fuel-based material consumption and changing lifestyles is a major driver of global resource use. Obviously, that's a bad thing. And the main contributor to rising greenhouse gas emissions, which for them is an absolutely terrible thing. It then goes on to say, and this is the big giveaway of net zero 1.5 degrees, limiting the rise in temperature to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels would require, quote, transformative systemic change and far-reaching changes in energy, land, urban infrastructure and industrial systems that would be unprecedented in scale. And it says, it's quite open about this, it says that 1.5 degrees presents the opportunity for societal transformation. This is not really about climate change at all. It is about transforming society. And when you look at the analysis of the IPCC report, what it essentially says is 2 degrees is really bad for the climate, and 1.5 degrees, surprise, is quite bad, but isn't as terrible as 2 degrees. Well, frankly, a child could have told them that. This is so blatantly obvious. But the worst thing is that having set up the problem like that, they don't look at the costs of 1.5 degrees. Costs for the IPCC are an embarrassment, which they just hide under the carpet. And any policy analysis that only looks at the benefits without the cost is entirely worthless. But it's essentially, the world community, and particularly the nations of the West, have bought into a program where the costs are not represented at all. And when you look at the House, when we come to Britain and adoption of net zero, there was a 90-minute debate in the House of Commons, and the government presented no analysis of the costs. In fact, they didn't present an analysis of the benefits either. But when you actually, the few figures in the IPCC report that are presented really should give anyone a pause for thought. It looks at the shadow price of carbon for 1.5 degrees. And in 2030, the shadow price of carbon, which if you like, is like a carbon tax that would be sufficiently high to drive to net zero in 2050, they reckon would range up to $6,050 per ton. Now that is if you just imagine, that is a colossal amount. Now, when you compare that to the estimated climate benefits actually worked out by the Obama White House, the social cost of carbon is equivalent to the benefits you get from not emitting that marginal ton of carbon dioxide. Undiscounted at that in 2030, it's $94 a ton. So you're talking about the costs being 64 times the hypothetical benefits. By any measure, at that point, discussion of net zero should really stop. When you're looking at something that is multiples of it more costly than any putative benefits, it really doesn't stack up. And I think the other thing that when you have to feed into this is that we hear the Europeans and Britain and so forth embracing net zero. But the question is, this only makes sense in climate terms and any rational terms if the whole world does that too. And it's worth then looking at actually the shrinking of the West in terms of carbon dioxide emissions. The last year in which the West emissions, carbon dioxide emissions, were higher than those of the rest of the world was back in 1981. By the time the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, the West emissions were only 46% of the global total. If you look at pre-pandemic emissions, they're somewhere around a quarter of global emissions. Now, Britain can embrace net zero and can turn itself into an economic zombie. But I think the big development will be that Britain and Europe, by embracing net zero, will really be left in the ditch by the economies of the Far East. And what we'll see is the rest of the world just ignoring this stuff, and they might enjoy a V-shaped or a U-shaped recovery out of the pandemic, but we will go from a COVID lockdown to a green slump. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rupert. So just picking up on one of the things that you were saying there, you meant, and you discussed this in your report, which is that contrast between West and East. And one of the graphs in there is a graph of the carbon emissions of the West, which have been stagnant almost for 40 years. And yet we see in the rest of the world that emissions have been rising quickly and at an increasing rate. So I wonder what you make of governments in the East, perhaps like China. How sincere do you think they're being in terms of going along with the UN climate agenda? Or do you think there's an element of cynicism there in terms of realizing that this is hurting Western economies much more than it's hurting them, and they might be able to potentially have an advantage from that?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, China had two. China, I think you're right to talk about it. That it was highly cynical. It had an interest in the $100 billion a year of climate finance that the West was promising. It's also done extremely well out of green policies in Europe. So out of nothing, China became the world leader in solar PV, and I think 9 out of the top 10 solar PV companies are Chinese, and they basically, you'll find Chinese solar panels littered all over Germany. But they have their construction coal-fired power stations continues unabated. They're also through their Belt and Road Initiative. They are financing coal-fired power stations across the world. And you mentioned the graph at the beginning of my report. And it's very interesting, as you say, that the West's emissions have flatlined. The emissions of the rest of the world grew steadily, and then at 2002 there's an inflection point, and there's a sudden acceleration in emissions. So they were growing at about, from 1979 to 2000, roughly 1.6% a year, and from 2002, 4.9% a year. So, and of course that's accompanied by a lot of millions and billions of people being lifted out of poverty. Those are the facts on the ground, and Western politicians have consistently ignored the clear evidence that the rest of the world is going to go its own sweet way.
Thank you. One of the people who inspired you to write this report was Professor David Henderson. And one of the things I like about the report is just what a full-hearted, full-throated defense of capitalism that it is, and really hits out at corporate social responsibility and a desire for businesses who perhaps see themselves as social engineers. Could you tell us a bit more about the late Professor David Henderson and what his case was against corporate social responsibility?
In fact, I met David first at an IEA event when corporate social responsibility was his target, and he sort of wound me up and he said, "My dear fellow, you don't believe in the triple bottom line." And I couldn't believe this guy had given the most amazing Reith lectures in the mid-80s. So, but it was a wind-up. And I think it was from that he got into the whole global warming and issue. And what David fundamentally argued was it doesn't matter what a business might think its mission is or should be. In acting in a capitalist market framework, the aggregate efforts of business in a free market economy are to raise living standards and thereby economies to grow. And the way he put it was, the primary role of businesses is they become agents of market-led change, but this is not because they have chosen to act as such. And then he says, the advances that capitalism has brought did not arise from the resolve of business leaders to make them possible, but from the operation of competitive market economies. And that's just such a profound insight. And what we're having now is where basically people are giving up on capitalism and progress, and they're saying, well, businesses have to be, if you like, they have to be like charities that happen to make money, that their job is to do good. They don't do good. Businesses don't do good by setting out to do good. They do good as if you like, as an unintended consequence in a capitalist system. The system, incidentally, that is the only system that has sustainably raised living standards, and not just raised them, transformed living standards. There was a quote in my, there's a quote from William Baumol, who was a great growth economist who studied innovation. And he points out before the Industrial Revolution, basically living standards were flat. And indeed, in the 18th century, before the Industrial Revolution, the consumption opportunities open to wealthy people were actually more limited than they were to a wealthy Roman centuries before. And it's the Industrial Revolution that has been completely transformative, and the underlying ideological program of this is to reverse or replace the Industrial Revolution.
Thank you. And finally, then, I think we actually heard a lot of these arguments about coming out of a recession in a green way, having a green recovery after the last financial crisis. But perhaps one difference between then and now is just how much businesses have now embraced the decarbonisation agenda. Are you worried about how that might influence policy this time? Or do you think that politicians are perhaps closer in tune with the need that the public will feel for a strong economic recovery to this crisis?
I have no confidence in politicians being economic realists, I'm afraid, Harry, none whatsoever. There's no evidence of economic realism, across the board, really. I think you're right, though, to put your finger on a major change, which is that business has been captured by the green movement, by the Greens, and it's partly because there's always been a strand in the business community of environmentalism. And in fact, the Aspen Institute in the late 1960s, which was meant to be a gathering of thinkers and business leaders, was actually running climate programs, way back in the late 1960s. And one of the guy the Atlantic Richfield CEO, who founded, I think, Friends of the Earth, he funded Friends of the Earth at the same time. So there's always been a strain in the business community. I think what's the big change has been what we call the greening of Wall Street, that finance can say, the decarbonisation, net zero, these are things that all must be done. And the reason finance can do that is because they don't make things, they don't grow things. Their production carbon footprint is very low. Their businesses are essentially indifferent to energy costs. If you look at, I looked at Goldman Sachs's income statement, and if you look at like property and those kind of expenses are 3% of its income statement. So energy is going to be a small proportion of its property costs. And then if you're in finance, you then say, well, you make investments in renewables and you just profit from rising. And so what they do, and then they buy renewable energy certificates and say we're 100% renewable. So the whole thing is a huge scam, if you like, from Wall Street and the city that can say, and Mark Carney, of course, being an absolute example of that, is that finance can pretend to be that it's zero carbon. But of course, the things that we depend on, they are not zero carbon, and you can't make them zero carbon. The effort to make them zero carbon will raise costs, it will lower living standards, and it will, as we're talking about in this webinar, it will mean that there isn't a recovery.
Okay, thank you very much, Rupert, and we look forward to coming back to you in the Q&A session a little bit later. So our next guest is John Constable. John Constable is our energy editor here at the GWPF, and he's also a director of the Renewable Energy Foundation, where he has been doing lots of excellent work on giving some real fine-tuned information, data, statistics on renewable energy subsidies and policies here in the UK. And he's done a lot of work with us on looking at particularly renewables and the policies that are involved and what their economic implications are. John, we're very happy for you to join us in this webinar, and it's over to you.
Thank you, Harry. I think what I'll do, I'll develop a point that Rupert made about lack of confidence in what politicians will do in response to COVID in the light of net zero. I mean, last year, we were already talking about the ways in which attempting net zero through renewable energy, because that is the only option on offer, was a threat to economic prospects post-Brexit. But that context has obviously changed. So we're now not talking about whether net zero is wise for a more or less intact and expanding national economic system, a system moving steadily further and further from thermodynamic equilibrium becoming more complicated, more satisfactory for human requirements. We're not talking about how net zero would affect an economy surrounded by other national systems, many of which were expanding at a greater rate and could be called upon to support growth and offset the negative effects of the policies that we might adopt. That question is now effectively being superseded. The answer, for the record, was it would have been deeply unwise, but that public resistance would have set in a year, 5 years later, so that a renewable net zero would have been a temporary perturbation, undesirable, very regrettable, but a temporary perturbation in a longer-term national and global trend. But that is all now of academic interest, really. And the question that now faces us is how attempts to deliver the net zero target will affect a national system and an international system that has been deliberately tipped into a state of contraction, surrounded by other national systems, all similarly, though not quite universally affected. And this attempt, this net zero attempt, will be made against a background of highly significant increases in geopolitical tension, at least impeding trade and perhaps threatening worse. The context in which we're now talking about net zero is not one of growth and globalization, but one of contraction and incipient isolationism. Now, you might think that in such a context, those still lobbying for net zero would be desperately worried, but that would be a mistake. In fact, the Greens and their corporate collaborators see this as a great opportunity, and I'm afraid they're correct. It is genuinely an opportunity for them. It's likely that administrations around the world will be very tempted to use tax and levy-funded public spending badged as low-carbon investment, really spending, to provide a stimulus to post-COVID economies. Now, of course, it's perfectly true that this would create a very large wealth transfer in an already contracting economy, and that would deliver a great absolute and relative wealth to those invested in the green industry. So there's a potential for tremendous inequality here. And there would be corresponding transfers of socio-political power. But even if governments understand the likelihood of those outcomes, the bureaucracy will press on, barely restrained, if at all, by elected representatives. And furthermore, net zero wouldn't actually exacerbate the economic problems of COVID-19 policies that it was designed to address. So it would be a failure. Nevertheless, administrations, I think, are likely to adopt green stimulus policies for a number of reasons, some of which are also paradoxically reasons for believing that a net zero stimulus is dangerous. And I'll sketch a few of them. And green spending is still perceived as unobjectionable because it's believed to generate a common benefit. So green spending is seen as less threatening than, say, spending on conventional energy, since alternative sources are perceived as, conventional sources are perceived as standard selfish big business, whereas renewables have a softer image. I mean, the truth, as anyone who knows the industry well, is that green businesses are, in fact, if anything, even less self-denying, less virtuous than others. But that's not currently the perception, and governments are well aware of this. In addition, green public spending would be seen to benefit businesses that can plausibly pretend to address a common threat, climate change. Therefore, that spending will be less resented by the public. The fact that there are other much less resource-hungry ways of reducing emissions is not well understood. And even if government does understand this point, it's unfortunately true that the resource-hungry character of renewables is in fact a positive attraction for a stimulus-seeking administration. And the reason for that is that the immediate gross effect of green spending is very large. Low carbon energy sources, green technologies generally are almost all, nuclear would be the exception, very low productivity technologies. And vast resource deployment is required to deliver measurable results. The net zero target, as outlined by the UK's Committee on Climate Change, for example, implies extremely heavy spending on electrification and the hydrogenization of transport and heating. Well, in the current situation, this cost is actually attractive for the administration, since they can spend a great deal with a relatively small number of policy instruments, reducing legislative and administrative burden. I mean, it's an efficient stimulus for them. Furthermore, low productivity technologies have simple presentational benefits. The consequences of green spending will be highly visible, and the numbers of people involved in them will be large. It'll genuinely seem as if something is being done to rebuild the economy. And that leads to a further point, which is perhaps the most worrying, which is that while low productivity investments are clearly undesirable, administrations, even those that understand the point, will actually persist in supporting them because the international green industries have successfully misrepresented themselves as cheaper than conventional energy, a falsehood in which global NGOs, organizations such as the International Energy Agency and various governments have all colluded, and they may now even believe. But the truth, which is readily easy to determine from published sources, is that capital costs and operation and maintenance costs for wind and solar are still very high, in some cases rising, and the grid system management costs of introducing wind and solar are vast. No other word will do. Nevertheless, British government departments and some academics persist in claiming otherwise. This error will eventually be found out, but not soon, which is part of a further reason that government will be drawn to spending on such things, because the gross effect of all public spending is immediate. The net effects, positive or negative, are delayed. There's a lag, meaning that it's the gross effect that interests bureaucracies and elected politicians, because that's within the decision horizon for them. For example, a large upfront expenditure on green technologies has a rapid gross impact, while the inevitable and very severe negative net effect will only materialize in 5 years, decade, or a decade's time. Now that can be compared with spending on highly productive and valuable technologies in energy. The upfront spending is actually smaller, while the gross effect, which is, so the gross effect is reduced. It's less marketable as public relations. The positive net effect, the highly desirable positive net effect, like all net effects, is delayed. So the result of this is that, paradoxical though it may seem, administrations aiming to stimulate an economy are actually positively drawn to what in other circumstances would be thought of as malinvestment. History, I think, shows this, but a misunderstanding of that history is actually another of the reasons that governments will be drawn to net zero as a post-COVID stimulus. This is really, I'm referring here to the positive aura around green state intervention, which rests very heavily on the continuing positive public understanding of Roosevelt's Roosevelt's New Deal, which of course also had a large renewable energy component, the Tennessee Valley Authority. However, the net benefit of Roosevelt's policy is highly questionable. I mean, subsequent analysis gives credit to Roosevelt for fixing the banking crisis, but raises the question that the public spending that followed, and for which the president is most often praised, actually delayed recovery. And it was only the demand created for war material that returned growth to trend. Now, there's continuing controversy about that, of course, but here in the UK, that debate is unknown. New Deal history is taught in schools as if it were an unquestioned success, and this is supported by cultural reverberations ranging from the grapes of wrath taught as a school textbook through to the sentimentalities of It's a Wonderful Life. Our understanding of Roosevelt's New Deal is shallow and obtuse, and it forms no reliable foundation for green net zero stimulus. Nevertheless, it's a very important element in it. Now, without exception, all these motivating considerations have short time horizons, and they're focused on the immediate effect of the activity. But I don't think there's any reason for believing that they're cynical. Some civil servants, some politicians may be aware of the hazards and persist nonetheless. But for the most part, they sincerely believe that they can safely take steps towards net zero, because what little long-term deep economic history and prehistory they understand is grounded in false conceptions of energy and its role in the creation of societal structure and wealth, human well-being. This shallow economic history persists in treating societies as if they were psychologically determined phenomena, not as they actually are, thermodynamic physical systems. This neglect of physical realities of societal wealth creation means that public spending undertaken in stimulus packages is typically aimed at the direct but temporary creation of the results of successful growth, namely employment and the appearance of a profusion of resources for consumption, when in fact they ought to be focused on restoring the fundamental conditions that generate those results, with a delay, obviously. Now, that criticism holds most probably of all government stimulus packages. Governments are universally impatient, but if the spending is aimed at energy, as it is certain to be in the net zero COVID packages that I think likely, the results will be extremely damaging in the longer term. What economic history demonstrates is that modern growth, modern levels of wealth are the result of the addition of high productivity energy sources. Much deeper in the past than we like to talk about. It's not just the Industrial Revolution. This goes back into the 1400s and the 1500s. It's a very long-term cycle. Now, for the UK to turn its back on those energy sources, for the world to turn its back on those energy sources, would have been unwise even in a state of continuing global growth, fundamentally driven by Asian use of coal and oil and a resurgent North American economy based on gas and oil. But to do so in a time of suppressed global trade and growth has the potential of being genuinely dangerous in the longer term, and perhaps even in the shorter term. Complex systems, such as a societal economy, they're typically stable only under the condition of expansion. And the rapid introduction of a large bulk of low productivity energy sources globally to deliver net zero and at a national level as well, will certainly not stabilize our currently contracting system. And the rapidity of that introduction could obviously make it much worse. So I completely agree with Rupert. I think that in spite of the fact that these net zero policies are extremely dangerous, more dangerous actually in the current situation than they were before, it's actually quite likely that politicians will adopt them. And a post-COVID stimulus package based on renewable energy would be a counterproductive disaster. Nevertheless, I fully expect the civil service in the UK to force it upon us, and I suspect it will be attractive internationally as well.
Thank you very much, John. Firstly, I think I would like to ask you about what is net zero? We have many viewers joining us from around the world, and although we're very familiar with net zero here in the UK, could you tell us a bit more about what it entails, what it means? And we've seen the electricity sector so far be a focus for efforts for decarbonisation. Which areas are next, and how challenging is that going to be to start decarbonising areas like heat and transport?
Yes. Well, the net zero targets, I think you have to interpret it as being, in effect, a requirement for 100%, a carbon-free economy. The potential for exporting emissions invisibly to other production centres in the world is, I think, unlikely to survive public examination. I mean, if government commits itself to a carbon-free future, they'll be held to it. So we should say that this is what they're trying to do, to decarbonise the economy completely. But not just simply to decarbonise it, because the route is also prescribed. It has to be renewable energy. I mean, if you were to propose a carbon-free economy on the basis of nuclear for the predominant and a certain amount of gas with carbon capture and sequestration, the carbon capture and sequestration element of it could be expensive, but it would be viable. You could engineer it. And with enough nuclear, it might not be quite ruinously expensive. But for various reasons, that route has been ruled out. You're looking at a renewables economy to deliver a low carbon economy for the world. In the UK, we've already had the Climate Change Act. We have extraordinarily difficult carbon reduction targets for the middle of the century, 80% reduction. Well, the net zero target requires you to move away from 80%, which is impossibly difficult and extraordinarily expensive. But of course, the last 20% or so is the most expensive. And it's the area where you have to do the most extraordinarily difficult and expensive things, decarbonising transport, and not just cars, but heavy goods vehicles, which means you have to move towards hydrogen and, for shipping, ammonia. And most difficult of all, you're quite determined to move domestic heating away from gas. You've got to electrify the heating, but then also avoid these extraordinarily high peaks in the winter when their heat pumps would no longer work because the ambient temperature was too low, and therefore people would switch to resistive load on the electricity network. They turn on bar heaters, and you'd have a vast spike on the electricity network. In order to avoid that, the Committee on Climate Change is proposing that there should be dual capacity heating systems. So you switch to hydrogen to avoid this very large peak. Now that means you've got to generate quite a lot of hydrogen. You're generating already quite a lot of hydrogen for the most difficult sectors of the transport system, including agricultural traction, believe it or not. But the production of hydrogen would all, in fact, come from methane, mostly, nearly all of it. Very little of it would be from electrolysis of electricity generated from renewables, which is not surprising because that is mind-blowingly expensive. So the cheapest way of producing hydrogen is steam methane reforming. But that, of course, is a bet on carbon capture and sequestration. You begin to wonder, well, if you're going to have carbon capture and sequestration to produce hydrogen, why don't you just have combined cycle gas turbines and carbon capture and sequestration to go with them? I mean, this is the way that net zero has been presented is simply the most expensive possible route you can conceive. I mean, it would not be difficult to find cheaper routes, but they would not involve the chosen technologies. And my suspicion is that ultimately this is being driven by those industries. So the agenda for net zero is not being driven by those who want net zero. It's being driven by those who want to be able to mandate certain technologies to deliver net zero, namely the renewables industry.
Thank you. One of the constant refrains that we have coming from both the industry, as you described, but also the political cheerleaders for renewable energy, is that the costs are coming down so quickly. And even with storage, which would be essential to provide a lot of that back power, they say, well, the costs for that are coming down as well. And I saw written recently an article claiming that battery storage could now be competitive with gas peaker plants as an option to provide backup electricity and grid security. What would you say to those people claiming that the costs are coming down very quickly, and therefore not only will renewables be what they see as the clean option, but it will also be the cheapest option in a short time horizon?
Check your sources. Capital costs and operations and maintenance costs for renewables plant can be determined from public sources such as company reports. There is no evidence of major and significant capex reduction in the wind industry, or indeed in the solar industry. I mean, they started at a very, very high level. Remember this, so you've got to get down below conventional energy costs, and they're still nowhere near that. Remember also, these plants have low productivity, their load factors are low, and their lifetimes are much short. So they've got high capex still, high O&M still. You can determine this from public sources. They don't last very long, and they're very unproductive. So from the consumer's point of view, they are still incredibly expensive. And as for the system management costs, these have been persistently misrepresented both by academics and the industry. And the true system management costs are, of course, very obscure because they're heavily socialized. So, for example, in the United Kingdom, management costs are socialized through issues such as the socialization of grid expansion and also of special grid measures to address fluctuations, uncontrollable fluctuations in wind and solar. I mean, in the first 2 months of this year, we spent over 90 million in the United Kingdom shutting or reducing output from UK wind farms. That's the tip of the iceberg. There's a much larger cost profile which is buried from the public view. I simply don't believe a word that is said about major cost reductions in this industry. And I wouldn't expect it, because the fundamental physics of these things is unfavorable. These are very high entropy input sources. To correct that energy, to deliver it, make it high quality energy, you're going to have to spend a great deal of money by applying capital and complexity to that energy flow to make it into a low entropy source. That's going to be costly. So cost reductions, there's no evidence for it empirically and of significance. And in fact, you wouldn't expect it from physical fundamentals.
And finally, we've also, as well as seeing the coronavirus pandemic, we've seen a huge oil price shock as well, with oil prices even going negative. So this has brought about a lot of pessimism for the fossil fuel industry. But also we've seen disruption to supply chains in renewables that have also led people to question the future of that industry as well. In the medium term, which industry do you think is going to come out better after this crisis? And what do you think the implications of the recent economic hits that we've had to these various sectors?
Fossil fuels are physically high quality fuels. These are very low entropy sources. If they're now cheap for consumers, that's tremendous news for the world's economies. They can, in other words, they can bring about changes, desirable changes at very low cost. So I've thought if costs are falling for the fossil fuel industry, that will make them much more attractive. Paradoxically, of course, it's also quite good news for the renewables industry, because one of the major costs in producing renewable equipment, wind turbines and solar panels, are actually fossil fuels. So if fossil fuels are cheaper, then renewables equipment will also become slightly cheaper. So they'll be able to boast about some kind of reduction. So there's a payoff for them as well. But the basic message here is that if fossil fuels are cheap, this is very good news for everybody, if governments are prepared to allow people to take that benefit. The only way to recover fundamentally from the restrictions being placed on economies for COVID-19 is to flush these economies with extremely cheap energy.
Okay, thank you very much, John, and we'll hear back from you again very shortly. Our next guest is Lord Lilley. He was a Conservative MP from 1983 to 2017 and was a member of the Cabinet from 1990 to 1997 as Secretary of State for Trade and Industry, and then also as Secretary of State for Social Security. And he's been a good friend to the GWPF and indeed published a report for us on the cost of the Climate Change Act. £300 billion, he estimated it at that time. But as we've seen, the Climate Change Act targets have risen quickly. There has been a significant amount of emission creep. What was going to be a 60% reduction in emissions quickly became an 80% reduction in emissions and is now a net zero target. So that's 100% reduction in carbon dioxide emissions. So we're very grateful to have him join us and talk about how he views that change and to bring in that crucial political dynamic. How have these measures gone through Parliament? How does Parliament feel about them now? And what are going to be the pressures on it to change in the future? So Lord Lilley, we're very grateful to have you, and please take it away.
Thank you very much. My starting point is the current COVID-19 crisis. To most people, it's a devastating health crisis. The measures to suppress which have created or set in train a devastating economic crisis. But to green campaigners, to advocates of state control, to believers in protectionism, and they're often, by the way, all the same people, this is viewed as a tremendous opportunity. Indeed, the economic consequences of the COVID crisis are very much what eco-campaigners want. It's the cessation of a great deal of human activity. It's required a more frugal lifestyle, at least for the masses, if not for the elites. And it's an opportunity for the state to take control of the economy and people's lives. It's the sort of thing they like. And that's not something which I'm just sort of plucking as an accusation out of the air. Lord Stern and Professor Stiglitz and others have recently published a report. And I'll just read you the opening remarks of it because it shows just how they see this. They say, the COVID-19 crisis could mark a turning point in progress on climate change. This year, global greenhouse gas emissions will fall by more than in any other year on record. The percentage declines likely in 2020, however, would need to be repeated year after year to reach net zero emissions by 2050. Instead, emissions will rebound once mobility restrictions are lifted and economies recover, unless governments intervene. There are reasons to fear that we will leap from the COVID frying pan into the climate fire. However, the crisis has also demonstrated that governments can intervene decisively once the scale of an emergency is clear and public support is present. COVID-19 has precipitated a major increase in the role of the state. This decisive intervention has begun to stabilize infection rates, prevent health systems being overwhelmed, and save lives. The climate emergency is like the COVID-19 emergency, just in slow motion and much graver. Decisive state interventions are also required to stabilize the climate by tipping energy and industrial systems towards newer, cleaner, and ultimately cheaper modes of production that become impossible to outcompete. End of quote. So you have it all there. They welcome the fact that the decline in economic activity has reduced global emissions by 8%, or probably this year. They say we need further reductions year on year. Actually, in the body of the report, they say there must be 7.6% per annum compound at least till 2030 to achieve, to put us on the path to net zero. They're afraid that if the economy recovers, that it'll reverse the 8% gain we've gained, let alone allow the continuing gains of further contraction to be enjoyed by them. And they welcome the role it gives the state in controlling the economy, by analogy with what the states had to do to control this health crisis. And of course, it's not just people like Lord Stern and the fellow Oxford economists, which he was writing with, but the European Commission has likewise urged member states only to give support to companies, which the Commission is approving, allowing company support in return for green commitments. It hasn't actually enforced that because it knows it will meet considerable resistance from some European countries, though others will make those sort of requirements and conditions in return for economic support and the relaxation of state aid rules. Now, of course, if there are green projects which are economic, which can produce electricity more cheaply than traditional means, or produce other benefits, they should go ahead. I have absolutely no ambition to fossilize, as it were, the reliance on fossil fuels. But if they are more economic, then they have no need for subsidy and no need for artificial support. So by definition, economists like Stern and the European Commission are advocating projects which are not economic in their own right, which wouldn't go ahead without artificial state support. Now, it should be obvious that getting the economy going again, after output has declined by more than a third, as the Bank of England projects, will be a daunting project. But if we artificially restrict the options of what the economy can do as it grows out of this deep recession, by saying it can only do things which are green approved, and if we try to channel resources away from existing activities which are economic, which haven't been affected by the COVID downturn, into green projects, then we're compounding the problems we face of getting out of this recession. Even if we suppose there are long-term climate benefits from switch to fossil fuels to green projects and renewables and the other activities they talk about, even if we suppose they do have those long-term benefits, by definition, they don't have them in the short and medium term, which is when we're trying to bring about an economic recovery and a return to prosperity. Now, how does Stern and Co. manage to claim that green projects will be helpful in the recovery rather than a hindrance to it? Well, of course, they draw on the multiplier effect that John was alluding to, the New Deal, so on, that when you had an economy depressed by lack of demand, Keynes said, even if the government were to pay people to dig holes and then fill them in again, that would get money into circulation, would bring about a higher level of activity. But this isn't a recession brought about by a collapse of demand. It's brought about by a suppression of supply. All the resources which were previously providing us with the hospitality industry, the entertainment industry, the travel industry, all the other industries which have been brought to a halt are still there. They are not operating because effectively they've been prevented from doing so. And if they're allowed to do so in future, and if we hopefully produce either a cure or a vaccine for this thing, this virus, they will resume activities. Secondly, it's to the extent that demand for some activities cannot be expected to recover because demand habits will have changed as a result of the COVID crisis, we need to allow the economy to redeploy the resources which were previously in those activities into the most economic alternatives. And free market economies are good at doing that. It's what they do all the time as outdated activities are replaced by new ones, as old technologies are replaced by new technologies, as demand changes, as new competitors arrive in one country, which means that you have to redeploy resources in another. So that's what economies are good at doing, free market economies are doing. But it's a painful process having to move resources from old activities to new. Adding to that problem at this time by saying, in addition to that, we're going to move resources from the brown industries, as they call them, to the green industries, compounds the difficulties of getting out of this recession. So it's best to leave the market to decide which the best opportunities are, rather than government saying, we'll only allow you to do a subset of the opportunities which are available to you, those which meet our green credentials, and we'll decide which of them are optimum and which are not. Dieter Helm has said recently, governments are not good at picking winners, but losers are very good at picking governments. And if we create a whole regime of subsidies for green projects, we can be sure that all sorts of losers will come out of the woodwork and persuade politicians to spend money on their favorite projects. Stern and Co. put forward as their main practical proposals for getting the economy going again on a green basis: large projects to insulate homes, more activity in forestry and planting trees, and of course, more wind and solar power. Well, John Constable has mentioned the absurdity of many of the claims that the latter are more competitive. If they were, they wouldn't need subsidy. And at the moment, we probably won't need a vast increase in energy capacity in the short term anyway. As far as the insulation of homes is concerned, it's a hugely expensive process. And it doesn't produce any significant immediate benefit other than, if it's successful, to the extent it's successful, some reduction in people's energy bills, which otherwise, of course, are being inflated by the increased cost of green energy. So the reason that Stern and Co. say these are good things is that they are all labor intensive. They employ more people than would investment in fossil fuels and traditional fossil fuel using activities. But employment is a cost. You don't want to invest in projects which have a high labor value per unit number of people employed per unit of value added created. You want to invest in things which have a high value added per person employed, or additional person employed. So we are effectively being invited to do things which will make a very difficult task a lot more difficult, which will have little, if any, economic benefit in terms of adding to output in the short term, but which will exacerbate the problem of getting out of this recession. You mentioned that I had done an analysis of the cost of existing proposals for green energy in this country, the cost of the Climate Change Act, and calculated on the basis of government figures what they're proposing to spend, that it will cost us 300 billion or over 300 billion, but up to 2030. Obviously, if we move to an even more demanding target of net zero, that cost will be a multiple of that. That is the cost of doing the easy things. The cost of doing the more difficult things, effectively of decarbonizing transport and decarbonizing heating, will be a multiple of that. And though governments may start down that route, they will rapidly find them very, very unattractive. Take heating for a start. If we are going to move from gas to electricity, electricity costs the best part of 4 times as much per British thermal unit as gas does. And even if it's slightly more efficient within the transmission in the home, we are going to be asking people to increase their heating bills by a factor of 3 or 4. And by and large, the further north you are in the country, the colder it is. The further north you are in the country, the more heating bills are a higher proportion of people's incomes, since incomes tend to be lower. I don't think the people who voted for this government in the Red Wall were voting to increase their heating bills by a factor of 3 or 4. And the government's going to have to realize that pretty rapidly if it wants to get out of this recession in a way which is sustainable and politically bearable. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lord Lilley. Just picking up straight away on that, with a few very notable exceptions, and I must pay tribute to them, but most of your fellow Conservative MPs, as they were then, and your colleagues in the House of Lords now on your own benches, have been incredibly silent on this topic, which requires a detailed questioning and requires people to put their heads above the parapet on this issue. So why do you think they're so reluctant to do so?
Well, originally, of course, because people knew little about the topic, they picked up the conventional wisdom from the media for the political class which they were joining. And the simplest thing was to go along with it. Many of them had reservations in the back of mind. It all seemed a bit odd and implausible, but it was simpler to go along with it than to question it. Those of us who had ceased to have further desire for office were freer to look into these issues than, say, the young and up-and-coming and ambitious politicians. And we didn't mind I didn't mind if people attached absurd labels to me. I have the advantage of having a scientific background at university. So when people say, oh, Lilley, you're a science denier, I say, no, on the contrary, I entirely accept the science of global warming, that if you increase the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, other things being equal, the atmosphere will become somewhat more warmer. The question is, how much warmer, and what's the cost, and what are the benefits of trying to mitigate it? But you have to be prepared to go into those questions if you're going to face up to the consensus. And it's very difficult because the BBC will not allow you on if you question it. And if you sneak on and question it, they will then I was by accident allowed it on and mentioned that the Met Office had forecast in 2004 that their new computer could forecast with certainty that the world would get 0.3 degrees warmer in 10 years later. By 2014, it hadn't, and I mentioned this fact. So not only did they issue a public apology, having people like me giving voice to someone like me, but they subsequently removed the podcast from their broadcast, and you cannot hear it. Now, we live in that sort of almost one-party state where the state broadcaster will not allow certain views to be expressed. And quite a lot of the other elements of the media, for some reason, go along with this. So it's difficult, and I don't particularly blame the younger generation of politicians for them to break free. But I think more of them will, as they see the costs coming through, and as they become more responsive to the common sense of the public. The public are much more skeptical of all this than any in the media, or most of the people in the media, and many of the people in the political class.
Okay, then what would you say then is the level of commitment to these policies by the government? We heard David Cameron first be a very big advocate, then he was talking about cutting the green crap. But then since then, we've had Greta Thunberg, we've had Extinction Rebellion, and now, of course, we've had the coronavirus pandemic, which has distracted a lot of attention away from the climate change issue. So how deep do you think is that level of commitment to this topic, both by the government, but also you mentioned the Red Wall earlier. How much is this an issue which is really one that's just happening in Westminster in policy circles? And how much is that commitment shared in the wider public?
I think initially the commitment to these policies, both by David Cameron and for all I know by Boris Johnson, was fairly shallow. But the danger in politics, as I think Disraeli said, the danger is that politicians come to believe their own rhetoric. And if you repeat something enough times, you start believing it, rather than the reverse, which ought to be the order in which things come out. You ought to believe something first before you start talking about it. But so a lot of them have become committed to them. It would be very embarrassing to do a U-turn. Before the last election, quite clearly, Boris Johnson wanted to focus on one thing and one thing only, and that was getting Brexit done and getting that issue to predominate. So he tried to put all other issues to bed and went along with the consensus on climate change. I don't know how deeply he believes it. Obviously, his father is an eco-warrior, and I believe his fiancée is an eco-enthusiast, so he's rather subject to domestic pressures. But we may assume that if public pressure changes against the, perceives the costs of the net zero target to be unacceptable, then politicians sooner or later will respond to them. And it's precisely the sort of people who were prepared to question the Euro consensus, who question the global warming consensus. By people, I mean ordinary voters, not among the chattering classes. And a lot of the new voters for the Conservative Party are in the areas of society and geography which are most affected by the costs of trying to pursue this absurd target. So to keep those voters on board, it may become politically necessary for politicians to do a change of gear. They won't do a volte-face. They won't say, oh, I was wrong. They will say, oh, the time has come to put that a little to one side while we focus on other things. So they'll sort of segue out of it if we're lucky.
Thank you, Lord Lilley. We've had lots of engagement on the Q&A board, and indeed I've had a lot of emails come in with questions from our readers and supporters. And I think one question has come through more strongly than any other one. And so I'd like to start off with that one, which is that probably the vast majority of people watching along now, and indeed our panelists, can see the problems with net zero and they can challenge it very cogently. But what their question is how do we get that message of skepticism and that message about the risks of pursuing a very deep decarbonisation strategy? How do we get that message out to the public? How do we engage with people and help stimulate that debate outside of these virtual walls? So I think, Rupert, if we could come to you first on that question.
Yeah, I think it's the effects of the policies that that will irritate people. I mean, Boris, the Prime Minister Boris Johnson has apparently said in Parliament today, inadvertently this year, the planet will greatly reduce its CO2 emissions. We need to entrench those gains. I don't want to see us go back to an era of the same kind of emissions as we've had in the past. So you can see them saying, well, actually making it more expensive for people to fly, perhaps, you know, the quarantine, 14-day quarantine for COVID. Well, we need to, you know, make having holidays in Florida or Spain or the Far East a thing of the past, or what Matt Hancock calls lavish holidays. It's that kind of thing, I think, will get people very, very angry. And if you look at the fuel price accelerator or escalator rather, that was ditched. That was a green policy and it was ditched. And it will be issues like that which will make the thing unworkable, in my view.
John, would you like to come on that as well?
Yes, well, as Peter said, people are not stupid. They already have concerns and doubts about this. The key then is to make sure that good information about the true costs of the policies is made evident and obvious to them before the harms done become manifest and irretrievable. I mean, we want people to be able to pull back and force politicians to pull back before the harms are really deep. And this means that we need to keep on unpacking the numbers. That's getting increasingly difficult. You know, the governments around the world are getting very cagey about releasing the costs of policies. So it's continual pressure on the bureaucracies to make sure that the true costs of the policies are actually still evident. And I'll give you an example from the United Kingdom. In 2014, the UK government published the last full study of the estimated impacts of its climate policies on energy prices and bills. It ceased to publish it in 2014 because it was embarrassing. We really need to force the British government to resume publication of such data. It's absolutely crucial. It must exist still. It must still be going on there behind closed doors. This is really an informational problem. As I say, people will make up their right minds. People will prefer prosperity and they will make the right decision, provided the information that's coming out to them is good. So it's transparency. State transparency is the crucial consideration here. Continual pressure to ensure continued transparency.
And Lord Lilley, would you like to comment?
Yes. Wherever the cost of climate policies has become manifest and a political issue, the Greens have lost, whether it be as a result, you know, when Macron tried to raise the price of diesel. I'm over in France at the moment. In France, it sparked off the Gilets jaunes movement and he was forced to retreat. In Holland, a party came up from nowhere to be one of the biggest parties in the regional elections on the issue of climate costs. In Australia, the government won a surprise victory, having defied the Greens and promised not to introduce a carbon tax. In Canada, likewise. So wherever it's become a political issue, the public is not on the side of the eco-warriors. It rather wants to maintain its standards of living. And so we have to exploit those opportunities to make clear to people why costs are rising and why they're having to bear these burdens. And the other half of it is to undermine the intellectual case, what the GWPF does in publishing documents which analyze at an intellectual level the case behind the green blob and pull them apart and show they're inadequate. That in the long run deprives them with a solid intellectual basis. And if they simultaneously face public pressure on the grounds of the costs, and the intellectual basis of what they purport to believe in has been destroyed, then there will be a change of heart.
Thank you. Our next question is more of an emotional one. I think, as well as being the facts and the arguments about economic growth and economic prosperity, what seems to be driving a lot of the green movement is a quasi religious feeling in which they find that maybe their overconsumption they feel is sinful, and getting emissions down is part of for them living a better life. And particularly we see young people attracted to a new kind of ideology where they can find their salvation through reducing their carbon footprint. But the flip side of that is they often demand quite radical totalitarian solutions for the rest of society. And some worrying polling came out recently, albeit relating to the COVID-19 pandemic, that for younger people in particular, it was less important that they had a democratic society. They wanted a more totalitarian society that could, or form of government that could deal quickly with the pandemic. So how do we challenge those emotional arguments and what could be seen as even a quasi-religious element to the green movement that is really hard to break down with facts and numbers? Rupert.
Yeah, I think the key thing with that, you'll never persuade people. Someone who believes that prosperity is immoral, I don't think you're going to persuade someone to change their mind on that. I mean, as they grow up, they might see some virtue in having some prosperity. But what you can do is flush that out, that is the kernel of environmentalism, is overconsumption, is that people have too much, they travel too much, they expect too much. Flush that out, and you can let voters decide, are they going to buy into an agenda that is designed to make them poorer? Because most voters they want a better life for themselves and their families. They want to go on holidays. They don't like spending more on fuel bills and so forth. And so I think it's really important to engage with it and put it all out, because if there's a fundamental contradiction in the climate change stuff. On the one hand, the planet is in peril, there's a planetary catastrophe. On the other hand, doing the right thing is all going to make us more prosperous. Doing the right thing involves making material sacrifices. We should challenge the Greens on that and challenge the Green programme. This is not about making people better off. This is about saving the planet. That involves sacrifice. Be honest. Be honest about it.
Thank you. John?
I think the question for sincere Greens to ask themselves with regard to central planning on this question is, what is the track record for central planning and state delivering a human requirement? Let's say that there's a human requirement to reduce emissions and to preserve the natural world. Is it more likely to come from a central plan system, which we know makes big bad mistakes, and history is rich in evidence of this, or is it more likely to come from the distributed decision-making of liberal societies where they're very responsive to information and immensely innovative and creative in the face of problems? And the answer is that liberal societies are much more likely to deliver positive environmental outcomes than authoritarian ones. And therefore, in order to produce liberal societies that are interested in such matters, they have to be beneficial for the individuals in those liberal societies, in which case they're going to have to be able to serve the requirements of those people in their own lives, as well as reducing emissions and preserving the natural environment, both of which could well be highly desirable things for most people. Therefore, you want policies that actually produce human well-being as well as planetary well-being. some compromise may be necessary, but imposing virtue, self-denial on large bodies of people from central government will firstly lead to errors, and secondly, will produce public revolt. It's very unlikely to be successful. Sincere Greens, if they want these outcomes, they're going to have to think very carefully about what kind of political economy and political system is most likely to deliver their wishes.
Thank you. Lord Lilley?
Well, I have the greatest respect for people who, for religious reasons, do believe in living a frugal life devoid of material excess. Monks and nuns who take a vow of poverty, chastity, and obedience, that is something admirable. What I do not like is those who want to force others to live a frugal life. And remember, it's usually the elite, the sort of, in America, the Sierra Club people, who don't want masses of people to go and visit national parks. They want the national parks to be for them, that they can go and not see anybody else and only see wild animals and so on. And there's an awful lot of that desire to keep the masses down so that the good, scarce things in life can be enjoyed by us, the elites. And it takes on this quasi-religious cloak sometimes to give it credibility, or justification, not really credibility. We've got to expose the hypocrisy of that by pointing out actually the consequences of what is often just presented in a theoretical way. Do people want a world in which there's no air travel? One of the best studies of what it would be involved in reaching the net zero target is a study called Absolute Zero by the Professor of Engineering at Cambridge, Julian Allwood, which is very honest. It says, we can't rely on any imaginary technologies that don't exist yet. We can only do it with existing technologies because new ones take far too long to introduce. And that will require us to do all these things, including forego air travel for a period, not rely on shipping for international trade. I mean, it is quite dramatic, the sort of changes that are required actually to achieve this. He talks about it as all, it's an engineering problem, it can be done if you are prepared to forego these things and bear the costs. But most people think, oh, well, if I stop using a few plastic bags and turn the lights off when I go to bed, I've done my duty and I can feel good. Well, that's a pretty inadequate religious substitute for really religious approach to life.
Thank you. I think one of the challenges that we have at the GWPF is to avoid being seen as people who are just prioritizing economic growth and the free market at the expense of the environment. So I think it's really important that we continue to highlight that as societies have become better off, as they have freer markets, they've also been able to devote more attention and resources to preserving the environment. And there has been what's seen as an environmental Kuznets curve of decreasing stress on the environment as countries have developed. And one small example of that is the air pollution in London. It was higher in the 1700s, at the very early stages of the Industrial Revolution, than it is now. And the streams are cleaner, the air is cleaner. So there are all sorts of elements of environmental progress. And even when it comes to reducing emissions, we've seen many technological elements and technological progress driving lower emissions without a cost to consumers. So what do you see as the future for maybe some technologically driven improvements, even in CO2 reductions? John, shall we start with you?
Economic history, to which I referred earlier, suggests that growth is related to the addition of lower entropy energy sources. They don't replace what's there already, but they supplement them and eventually exceed them in volume. I would be very optimistic about a long-term future for hydrogen if nuclear was the primary source of energy. Hydrogen is a carrier, after all. This proposal has been around since the 1970s. When Marchetti proposed it, it's still a very good idea. Hydrogen is a difficult gas to handle, and it requires a very rich society to actually do so safely and successfully. But it could well be extremely interesting. But like all these things, it requires high quality energy as the input. We're not going to see any significant invention and innovation in any part of our economy if we degrade the quality of the primary energy supply coming in. If we are prepared to increase the quality of the energy and primary input, and I think nuclear is a very obvious choice, gas short term, nuclear longer term, then the prospects for further sophistication and indeed cleanliness are extremely promising. It's a very bright future, provided that you maintain and further increase the quality, that's the low entropy quality of the primary energy supply of the society and economy.
Lord Lilley? One of the difficulties is getting over to young people that the environment has been getting better, at least in capitalist societies. It was trashed in many socialist societies. And one of the paradoxes is that we have elevated someone like Greta Thunberg to a guru on this issue. The one thing we know is that she has less experience of changing weather patterns or changing environmental issues than almost anybody else. She's only been on the planet 16 years. She can probably remember back about 10. One of the advantages of being ancient like me, and I'm nearly old enough to run for president of the United States, is that I can remember way back when smog was so terrible in London. To find my way to school, you couldn't see more than 2 feet ahead of you. I had to hold the fences of the houses I went along to find my way to school. It was invisible. We've solved that with the Clean Air Act. They think that the recent floods and so on are something new and unprecedented. They don't remember the Linton and Lynmouth floods in East Anglia, which killed hundreds of people. So we've got to get over to people some facts, and that's very difficult. We don't have access to the media. We don't have access to schools and to some extent not even to universities. But somehow we've got to infiltrate these places and just acquaint people with reality.
Thank you. I think our final question should be reacting to the present circumstances and the recession that is burgeoning and may come to overwhelm all other discussions as this crisis moves forward. So how does the recession dynamic change things as we go ahead? And what kind of pressures will that put on the debate? Rupert.
I think much depends on voters' perceptions of the success the government has in handling the COVID pandemic and the recovery, because we see the state deploy more control than it has ever done over people's lives, has ever done. And so a lot of faith is being put in the government, and the government has effectively put the economy into a coma. Is it able to restore the economy? If the government actually appears really, if government control appears incompetent and people suffer as a result, and the perceptions are that, well, we've made these sacrifices and they've really screwed up. I think the ability of politicians to argue for more government control to achieve net zero is vastly reduced. But one can see the sort of cry of protect the NHS morphing into now we've got to save the planet. And I think that politicians can make that argument if they have successfully shown that they have restored economic growth. And my view is that actually the government's handling of the pandemic has been absolutely terrible, and it just can't do, the British public sector can only do one thing at a time, and that not very well. And I think as we come out, we'll have, and also as the economic damages, the furlough, the cost of the furlough and so forth, I think just there's going to be just the most horrendous mess as the tide all goes out, that people's confidence in politicians trying to take on these big things will have been shattered.
Thank you. Well, we're running a little short for time, so I think we're going to move on to a few last statements from our speakers. So John, would you like to give your closing remarks?
Right. At present, the UK is spending about £10 billion per year, providing income support to renewable electricity generators. This is to say nothing of the system costs that those generators impose on consumers. In the context of COVID-19, those costs are utterly indefensible and they should be curtailed. It might even be cheaper for the state simply to buy those generators off the system and get rid of them for the time being, and perhaps permanently. There is no case for continuing to spend over £10 billion a year, plus including system costs, on subsidising a substandard low-quality electricity generator when the British economy and its people are struggling to recover from the COVID-19 shutdown.
Thank you. Rupert.
Yeah, I think I'm going to answer actually an earlier question, which is the environmental. What do we say on the environment? And I think what we have here is an ideology where with renewables and so forth, which is to save the environment, we have to destroy the environment. And we've seen that with wind farms and solar. But the most interesting development over the last few weeks in our kind of world is, I think, the Planet of the Humans, where the environmental movement, Michael Moore's movie, which anyone who hasn't watched it really should watch it. Because what you have within the environmental movement is you have the tree burners, which is the rent seekers of the environmental movement, set against the tree huggers, the tree burners versus the tree huggers. And I think that from our side, we need to expose them at their weakest point. And biomass, biofuel policies, if you care about the environment, if you care about orangutan habitat and so forth, these policies are absolutely indefensible. And when the Greens start fighting themselves, which I think the Michael Moore movie opens up that front, I think things will begin to change.
Thank you. And Lord Lilley, would you like to close things up?
Yes, my worry, really in response to the last question, is that if the government does manage to protect the NHS, stabilise, and we eventually come out the other side, the COVID virus is suppressed until we've got a vaccine and a cure, it is seen to have won. The fact it's done so in an incompetent manner, if that's the case, will be blamed on the politicians, not the state. And the danger is then people will see that this is a rerun, a prelude to doing something similar for the climate, that the state can control the economy, make it grow again, and solve the climate crisis, just as it allegedly will have done to the COVID crisis. That's the worry. And if you look back to the war, Britain won the war, having mobilized the economy just with the war in mind, and saw that as a natural paradigm for running the peace. Because we've been successful, we then tried to run the economy as a state-run economy, nationalizing industries, controlling prices and whatnot. Germany, by contrast, had lost the war. Its faith in the ability of the state to run things was destroyed, and it created the ground for people like Erhard to liberate the economy and turn over decision-making to business and consumers. So the danger is that victory in one sort of context, it's obviously necessary for the government to be involved in tackling COVID, is seen as a reason for it getting involved in another. And it's important that we highlight the fact that actually during this crisis, it's been the private sector and decentralized decision-making which has been most effective. Centralized decision-making, as by Public Health England and the largely autonomous NHS, has been less than glorious, and that should not be a model for running the economy or for as a recipe, lead us to the arrogance of believing that we can control the climate through public sector activity. So I'm worried that the wrong lessons will be drawn from this crisis.
Thank you, Lord Lilley. Well, that just leaves me to say a big thank you to our panelists. I think you've provided some really thoughtful and articulate arguments, and I thank everyone else who's been watching along for joining us today. So I would just like to end off with a plea. I think we've got a big challenge. We've got a big challenge to persuade a lot of people to rethink their views about climate change policy, but I think we can do it, but we all need to go away. And there's never a bad time to talk about climate change policy. We've got to keep banging on the drum. And from conversations I've had with all sorts of people, there's a lot of skepticism out there, and we just need to harness it and bring these arguments to the fore. So thank you again, everyone. And we look forward at the GWPF to hosting another webinar again soon. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.